Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoy true horror stories, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which story you liked most. Now, let's get started. This happened to me last winter, and even now, thinking about it sends chills down my spine. I live alone in a remote area of northern Maine, about 25 minutes outside of Bangor. My house sits on 5 acres of land, surrounded by dense forest. The isolation never really bothered me before that night. It was mid-January, and we were getting hit by one of the worst snowstorms I'd seen in years. The wind howled so loud it sounded like someone screaming, and the snow was falling in thick sheets, blanketing everything. I'd been working from home that day, trying to finish up some reports before the weekend. Around 7 p.m., just as I was heating up some leftover pasta for dinner, the power went out. That wasn't unusual during storms, which is exactly why I had a generator installed behind the house last year. It was supposed to kick on automatically when the main power failed. But the house stayed dark. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen drawer and threw on my heavy winter coat, figuring I'd have to check what was wrong. The moment I opened the back door, the wind hit me like a punch to the face. The temperature had to be close to 0, and the snow stung like needles on my skin. My flashlight cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop: footprints. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading directly to the generator. They couldn't have been more than 30 minutes old, or they'd have been covered by the falling snow. I live alone. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away. Nobody should have been on my property, especially not in that weather. I followed the footprints cautiously to the generator, my heart pounding with every step. The control panel was wide open, and some of the wires had been tampered with, cut or disconnected. With shaking hands, I managed to reconnect what looked loose and hit the reset button. The generator hummed to life, and the house lights flickered back on. I sprinted back inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking every other lock in the house. I tried calling the police, but my cell service was spotty thanks to the storm. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe it had been an animal that somehow knocked something loose. But deep down, I knew those were human footprints. 15 minutes later, just as I started to calm down, the lights flickered. Then they went out again. This time, there was no mistaking it. I heard the distant click of the generator shutting off. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously to the living room window. The snow was coming down heavier now, and visibility was terrible. But then the beam of my flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting away from the generator and into the tree line. At first, I thought maybe they were leaving. Then I realized they weren't. They were repositioning, circling the house to avoid being seen. My heart raced as I crept back to the kitchen, double-checking the locks. That's when I heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots in the snow. This time, the sound was coming from the front porch. Whoever it was, they weren't just cutting the power anymore. They were testing the house itself. I crouched low, barely breathing, as the sound of boots moved methodically around the perimeter of the house. It felt like the walls were paper-thin. Every few seconds, the footsteps would stop, followed by the faint clink of metal. They were trying the windows, one by one. My hands trembled as I fumbled to dial 911. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way, but it would take at least 15 minutes to get there in the storm. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. I sat in the dark living room, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, listening to the footsteps as they circled the house. Occasionally, I'd hear the crunch of snow as they moved, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal tools clinking together. When I finally saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the snow through my window, I almost cried with relief. The officers found a man crouched behind the generator with a backpack full of tools. They said he'd been methodically disabling it, trying to cut the house's power completely. His car was hidden about a mile down the road, tucked behind some trees. Turns out, he was wanted for a string of burglaries in the area. His method was always the same: disable the power during bad weather, wait for the homeowner to leave or fall asleep, and then break in. The cops told me I was lucky. If I hadn't noticed those footprints when I did and fixed the generator, he would have assumed I'd gone to bed and tried breaking in much sooner. Since that night, I've installed security cameras and motion sensor lights all around the property. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the lights flicker, I still find myself staring at the windows, waiting, and watching, for footprints in the snow. What I'm about to share happened last winter at a remote ski resort in Vermont. I've kept quiet about this experience for months, but after stumbling across a recent online post describing something eerily similar, I knew I had to come forward. Back then, I worked as a travel blogger, visiting off-the-beaten-path locations across New England. My friends, Maria and Drew, usually joined me on these trips, something I'm now eternally grateful for, because I don't think anyone would believe this story if I'd been alone. We'd booked one of the resort's most isolated cabins, about 2 miles from the main lodge. The first red flag came during check-in. The manager seemed hesitant to give us that specific cabin. He even offered us a free upgrade to one closer to the lodge. We declined, thinking we'd lucked out with a secluded spot. Looking back, I should have noticed how his hands trembled while handling our paperwork. The day passed normally. We skied, snapped photos, and settled in for the night. That's when everything took a turn. I still struggle to explain it. It was around midnight when Maria first spotted it through the frost-covered window, a dark figure gliding down the unlit ski trail. Anyone familiar with skiing knows that night skiing, especially on advanced trails like that one, is not just dangerous, it's practically suicide. But what caught our attention wasn't just the time of night. It was how it moved. This figure was skating effortlessly down a black diamond slope. No poles. No gear. Just this impossibly smooth motion, as if it was floating above the snow. Then it stopped, dead center, in front of our cabin, about 30 feet from the window. It just stood there, completely motionless. Drew grabbed his flashlight, and when the beam hit the figure, we finally saw it, something I still see in my nightmares. It was unnaturally tall, almost stretched. But the worst part, and I know how crazy this sounds, was its appearance. No winter gear, no discernible features, just this dark, elongated form that seemed to swallow the light. Then, in a movement that defied physics, it glided backward into the tree line, maintaining its perfectly upright stance, like a chess piece being slid across a board. We thought that was the end of it. We were wrong. Around 1 a.m., the sound started. That shh of skis cutting through fresh snow, circling the cabin, slowly, methodically. The sound would stop at each window for several minutes, as if someone was standing there, watching us. Sometimes we heard something worse, a soft, scraping noise against the walls, like fingers dragging across the wood. The longest night of my life was spent huddled in the living room, listening to those sounds move closer, then further away, but never leaving entirely. At one point, and this still makes my skin crawl, we heard whistling. A slow, haunting version of Jingle Bells carried through the dead of winter at 3 a.m. When the sun finally rose, we ran outside to check the snow. And that's what haunts me the most. There were no tracks. The powder around the cabin was completely untouched. No ski trails. No footprints. Nothing to prove anything had been out there all night. But here's why I'm finally sharing this. Last week, I received a message from someone claiming to be a former resort employee. They told me about an incident from the 1970s, when a skier got lost in a blizzard near where our cabin now stands. When the rescue team found him 3 days later, he was frozen solid, still standing upright on his skis, leaning against a tree. Despite the brutal cold, his face reportedly bore an unnatural, wide smile. The message included an old newspaper clipping of the rescue. The body's position, the unnatural tilt of its head, it was identical to what we saw that night. I did some digging. Over the past 40 years, there have been 6 other reports of people seeing a lone skier on that trail at night. Every description matches what we saw: unnaturally tall, gliding smoothly without equipment. 3 of those reports also mentioned hearing jingle bells being whistled. I've quit my vlogging career since that night. Some stories just aren't worth telling. But I need to know, has anyone else experienced something similar at this resort? Part of me hopes no one responds. But another part of me needs to know we're not alone. And if you ever go skiing in Vermont, and someone offers you a free upgrade to a different cabin, take it. It happened last winter, and to this day, I still can't fully explain what occurred. My friend owns a rental cabin in a small town nestled deep in the Adirondacks. He usually rents it out on Airbnb, but this time, he let me stay for free on one condition: I had to clean up after the last guests. It sounded like a great deal. A cozy weekend in the woods, some peace and quiet, exactly what I needed after months of non-stop work. When I arrived, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the landscape with a soft white blanket. The cabin looked picturesque from the outside, but the interior was a different story. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink, beer cans scattered everywhere, and garbage overflowing. The place smelled stale, like a group had been partying hard for days. I sighed, turned on the radio for some company, and got to work cleaning up. That's when I noticed something odd outside the living room window. Fresh footprints in the snow. They weren't faint or old, they looked recent, like someone had been walking around the cabin just moments before I looked. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe the last guests had taken one last walk before leaving. But then I noticed the trail of footprints wasn't random. They circled the cabin, several times, before disappearing into the woods. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I tried not to psych myself out. It's probably nothing, I told myself and kept cleaning. By evening, the snow had intensified. The wind howled against the windows, creating an eerie soundtrack to my unease. Just as I was settling in to relax, I heard it, a crunch of snow outside. Footsteps. I froze. The sound moved slowly from one side of the cabin to the other, passing directly by the living room window. I turned off the lights and carefully peeked outside, but the darkness and the heavy snowfall obscured everything. My heart was pounding, but I tried to rationalize it. An animal, I thought. Maybe a deer. I texted my friend, describing the sound I'd heard. His reply was casual: probably a deer, nothing to worry about. Hours passed, and the cabin grew quiet again. I started to feel like I'd overreacted. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside my bedroom window. Each step was heavy and intentional. Definitely not an animal. Then I heard something worse, faint voices coming from downstairs. Muffled, unintelligible words. My stomach dropped. I strained to listen, barely breathing, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It wasn't the wind. Someone was inside. My friend's words echoed in my head, probably a deer. This wasn't a deer. I gripped my phone and stayed frozen in place, my mind racing. Slowly, I forced myself to move, tiptoeing to the bedroom door. The voices had stopped, but now there were soft creaks, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards below. I cracked the door open just a sliver. The hallway was dark and cold, and I could feel the chill of winter creeping up the stairs. I knew something was wrong. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the stairs. With each step, the air grew colder. At the bottom, I froze. The back door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the draft. Fresh snow had blown inside, and there were footprints, leading in. Panic overtook me. I couldn't go closer. I bolted back upstairs, slammed the bedroom door, and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the police. The operator answered, and I stammered through an explanation, my voice trembling. She told me to stay calm and remain locked in the room until officers arrived. The wait felt like hours, though it was probably no more than 15 minutes. When I finally heard knocking at the front door, I sprinted to let the police in. My breath fogged in the icy air as I tried to explain what happened. They searched the cabin and the surrounding property.